everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is congressional candidate and Westchester County Executive George Latimer. George, thank you so much for joining me once again.
Brittany, it's nice to be with you again.
The race has really heated up since we last spoke just a few months ago. You recently picked up an endorsement from someone big, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. I do want to read her endorsement and then get your reaction. She wrote this in part on Twitter. With Trump on the ballot, we need strong, principled Democrats in Congress more than ever. In Congress, George Latimer will protect abortion rights, stand up to the NRA, and fight for President Biden's agenda, just like he's always done. What's your response to her message?
Well, I'm very grateful for it. I mean, Secretary Clinton is a very popular figure here in this area. When she served as United States Senator for almost a decade prior to becoming Secretary, people think of her presidential. We knew her as a person who represented us in Washington, and she knew her way around the district. So it's a very helpful endorsement, and I'm grateful for it. I also think so much of the discussion in this race has turned to foreign policy, where people might think that we're running actually for Secretary of State here in the 16th Congressional District. And to have the endorsement of a former Secretary of State who did an excellent job in that role is also very helpful. So I'm appreciative, and I think it shows the breadth and the depth of the support that I've gotten in this race.
You are right. You bring up an interesting point. A big contention point in this race is your stance on Israel versus Congressman Jamaal Bowman's. And we will get to that in a little bit, but I do want to talk about those kitchen table issues that really matter to voters. I want to reiterate that you are running for the congressional seat that is currently Congressman Jamaal Bowman's, and this is one of the most competitive races in the country. And I think a reason for that is because it really shows a split in the Democratic Party. You have someone like Jamaal Bowman who is in the squad. You have someone like yourself who is painted as a more centrist, moderate Democrat. So I do want to talk about one of the top issues facing voters, which is inflation. What's the biggest difference between you and Jamaal Bowman when it comes to assuaging New Yorkers' fears when it comes to inflation and the economy?
Well, I think what I bring to this race, aside from difference in philosophies, and there's not as much difference in philosophy as the other side would have you believe. My record has been extremely progressive as a elected official. Is Brittany that I've actually been involved in government. I run a government right now for 6.5 years. I've been in the state legislature prior to that, and local legislatures before that. So we've taken direct action, things like at the local level, free buses. We suspended sales tax on home heating products during one of the winters. We've done things to help make life more affordable in a practical way. This is not just theoretically saying we ought to do this and we ought to do that. I go to Washington with an understanding that the federal government needs to take similar type actions in order to make life more affordable. I think probably the one thing that I hear at the federal government level is the reversal of the loss of the SALT deduction, state and local tax deduction for people's taxes. We have a lot of people who own homes, including people of modest incomes, middle class, working class, individuals who are house rich and cash poor. And losing that deduction, or losing most of that deduction a few years ago, has hit them very hard financially. And the reversal of that, restoring that cut, would be appropriate. And I've indicated that I'd like to transition some of the tax cuts that were given to the wealthiest and transition it back to those of the middle class nation. So I think that is one singular important issue. Also, when federal government allocates resources for various services locally, it means that they cost less to the individual as they live their lives. If you have a benefit provided to people who have college loans that are outstanding, then you benefit their bottom line by reducing the amount of money they have to pay on those loans. You benefit them by reducing the child care costs, which we have done in Westchester County, more money for child care responsibilities. But I think it's those kind of backyard practical issues that help people feel that the government is more responsive to them. And frankly, it is the number one issue I hear as I walk around the district. Now, I've been county executive. I talk to people all the time, whether I was running for Congress or not. And when I hear those things, we act from a county level in a concrete way. We need to act in the federal government in a concrete way.
I do want to talk about those ideological differences between you and Congressman Bowman when it comes to the economy. You've argued in a recent interview that you would combat economic inequality better than the incumbent because you would work with a base of people rather than, as you said, he sits on the side with the squad. In your ads, you say you produced real progressive results. So, how do you work across the aisle, work with a broad coalition of people while still producing those real progressive results?
Well, I think what happens is you look at issue by issue where there is common interest between Congress members of both parties. Excuse me. And there are people who represent in the other party districts that are similar to mine, suburban districts outside of other major cities. And where we identify the cost of transportation into the main center city as being an important expense and federal assistance and transportation, we can do some of those costs that can be challenged. Where we see the federal government putting money into affordable housing and that reduce those costs. Housing costs are high here. They're high in the suburbs of Chicago, Philadelphia, Atlanta, you name it. And those are similar situations. The interest of the legislators who represent those districts, be they Democrats or Republicans, have common cause to try to address. And that's what I would try to do, work with those legislators on the strategies that could get us there. Now, I did that when I was a state legislator and worked within my delegation of Democrats, but worked across the aisle with Republicans. I'm afraid that what happens when you isolate yourself at the far left or the far right of the spectrum, Marjorie Taylor at the far right, and Jamaal Bowman and some of his colleagues at the far left, you don't have those relationships in place. You're too much ideological. You're lecturing to people. You're not working with people, and so you don't have those relationships necessary to try to move legislation that could, in theory, help all of us. And I do think we're talking about housing, we're talking about transportation, we're talking about job development, and then climate change issues, real world actions in those areas that would have an economic benefit to the American people.
You mentioned climate change. Jamaal Bowman is an advocate of the Green New Deal. Is that something you would support full stop, somewhere in between? What does your fight on climate change look like?
Well, I support the Green New Deal, but here's the problem. It doesn't have enough support to move forward in the Congress. So you can't sit there with an ideal piece of legislation that isn't moving and then do nothing else and just say, well, they haven't supported it, and so we're going to hold on to this standard. I look at the component pieces and could we move forward in a clean water initiative or a clean air initiative as a separate entity? The perfect example of it is what we've done in Westchester County by expanding the electric vehicle infrastructure, more charging stations around our county, electrifying our bus fleet, and then also our car fleet, county-owned cars. When we do that, we reduce air pollution. We get off of fossil fuels, and that is a concrete action. Now, if we're looking at a Green New Deal that would reduce carbon emissions and we can't get the whole Green New Deal done, well, then let's make sure we get to electrify school buses everywhere in the nation. That is a component of creating cleaner air and getting off of fossil fuels. And we may find common ground on that portion of the deal in order to move forward. And that's my thinking. This is, Brittany, the thing is this. I've been a legislator in four separate legislative bodies prior to becoming county executive. I'm not here to talk about theoretical debates. I'm here to talk about what can we do that will actually move the ball forward. When I was in the state legislature, I know on other issues, we raised the minimum wage. We protected women's right to choose. We banned high-capacity guns in the state. We actually got some of these things done, and we had some bipartisan support for some of these issues. That's the mindset I take to Washington. I think in Washington right now, you have people that get locked into ideological positions, and they're not looking at things in a practical way. I'm not trying to figure out, well, if we can't get the whole loaf, let's get a portion of it now, and then save the next piece for when we have consensus to move forward. That's my mindset, and I think that's the greatest difference between me and my opponent. I understand how a legislature can work, and I'm prepared to work within that structure as opposed to sit outside that structure and give speeches.
That's a really interesting point because I've heard you in other interviews push back. You've said in ads, like I said, that you've produced real progressive results. You kind of push back on the notion that you're more moderate, more centrist. Why do you think there is this disconnect when it comes to George Latimer?
Well, I think part of it is that people who call themselves progressives are actually radical. Let's face it. My opponent has been endorsed by the Democratic Socialists of America. Their stand is they want to end capitalism and install socialism as the economic structure of the country. That's not going to happen, and that would be a disaster for this country. So when you have that mindset that you think a socialist answer is to nationalize all efforts and programs and take away the private sector investment process, or you look at the private sector investment as intrinsically negative. I hear him talking all the time about corporations are bad, corporations are bad. I spent 20 years working in corporate life before I went to public office. And corporate policies around corporate self-interest that can still wind up with social goods. We've been able to do that in a host of different areas, but it requires you to get off of the ideological platform and get down, roll up your sleeves, and get into where you actually work on different issues and you make progress. There are many corporations here in Westchester County, where I've governed, that have been willing to help us on issues of climate change and issues on transportation and job growth. So I don't think we do much when we demonize sections of the electorate, and I think that's what happens on the far left, and it happens on the far right. They demonize groups. They say these people are bad and they're evil, and we can't work with them. We must have transformational change. Well, America has generally made change incrementally and cooperatively. You bring the voters along with you with that change, rather than impose the change unwillingly against the general group of people. I've had success in Westchester County doing it this way, and I think we could see that success in Washington if we really want to make it that way.
I do now want to pivot to a number two issue facing a lot of voters, and that is immigration. And Congressman Jamaal Bowman said that this is missing from the conversation when it comes to immigration and border security, that we need, quote, more FEMA support, more humanitarian support, and more judges and social workers and lawyers to help process those who are coming in. Both sides of the aisle say there's a crisis. What do you think's missing?
Well, I think what Jamal said is what most everybody says. I'm running a government that has migrants coming into it, and we clearly need more humanitarian aid, more judges. I've called for a judicial immigration court to be established in the federal courthouse in White Plains as a way to handle those migrants that are with us. There was an initiative that was stopped a couple months ago, I'm afraid, by former President Trump, in which Democrats and Republicans were sitting down across the aisle to try to hammer out a bipartisan arrangement. It's going to take legislation to really fix the problem at the border. It can't be done by executive order, given the power structure of the government. And in that final arrangement, you need to have greater border security. I don't know that you need a big, beautiful wall everywhere, but you do need greater border security. You need to be able to vet people and deal with who they are, with the history before they get into the country. You need to reform the asylum system and restructure it in a way so that you're not doing 2 years, 3 years wait. Bad things happen when people live in hotel rooms or in marginal residential populations. You do need to make sure that force of people coming over the border, that is a workforce, that they work on the books and not in the underground economy, and that they get channeled where the economy needs them. The agricultural portion of this country needs migrant immigrant workforce. And when the governor of Texas sends them to New York City, Philadelphia, Chicago to make a point, he's not sending them to where they're most in need, and in some cases where they have the experience working in an agricultural context, because those states, have a philosophy that doesn't want them here. But we need the labor, so we have to restructure the way the work visa program is structured, and how we handle issues that deal with earning citizenship all the time. All of that could be negotiated in a macro bipartisan bill, in the same way that there was a bipartisan infrastructure bill. It will take both parties' extremes to sort of get off the ledge and let those of us who have a working mindset in the middle come to the compromises and the negotiations that could get us to a bill that hopefully could be signed into law. It will depend on the construct, as you well know, who's sitting in the White House, who's sitting in the leadership rooms of both the Senate and the House, which at this point in time is unknowable. My hope is that if I do go to Washington, I go with colleagues who are willing to work through these issues, and we avoid what we've seen over the last couple of years, which is just the rhetoric being far more important than the results.
George, you mentioned this at the top of the interview, but this race has really come down to foreign policy, as you said. It's one of the first questions you get in almost every interview that I've seen from you, and it's one of those dividing lines between your policy as well as Jamaal Bowman's. And you guys really differ here. He's called for a permanent ceasefire, which would include a, quote, release of the hostages, humanitarian aid getting into Gaza as quickly as possible, all parties coming to the table to build and create a pathway to peace that would hopefully finally get us to a two-state solution. So that's what he said. How does your position here when it comes to Israel differ from his?
Well, first of all, he has not called for the hostage release until fairly recently. He originally did not put hostage release in his original call for ceasefire. That's a big difference. When he polled the issue, he said, "Do you favor voters? Do you favor ceasefire?" Everybody favors a ceasefire. But what he didn't say is that his call initially was for ceasefire, regardless of release of hostages. And if you don't release the hostages, then you don't really have a path to peace. You have kidnapped people and you're withholding them as bargaining pawns in this game. Ultimately, I think the president has tried to find the right path far more so than what Congressman Bowman is saying. And I think he is trying to find a way to get both the Israeli government and the Hamas regime at the table. Hamas is very difficult to deal with. You have to work with Qatar and some of the other Arab nations because they don't want to interact directly. They are hostile to the United States. Their patron, Iran, is hostile to the United States. And it's not as easy as he might say, let's all get to the table and negotiate those things. Certainly, both sides are going to have to make concessions. But here's the broader answer to your question, Brittany. My position on Israel is consistent with the Democratic mainstream in the House. Speaker to be, if he does become Speaker, Hakeem Jeffries, Greg Meeks, Grace Meng, Adriano Espina, Richie Torres, they are all supportive of the state of Israel, but they're also negotiations that lead to a two-state solution. And that is the path that I'm. The reason why there's such a disagreement between me and the incumbent is because the incumbent has joined the squad, only one of a handful of people that wants immediate ceasefire and permanent ceasefire before certain issues are negotiated. And I think we have to be much more strategic. And I'm following at this point the president. Now, from day to day, there are different stories that come out. And obviously, those of you in the news media, you report on today's story. I am not the type of person that likes to comment every single day on every single story I hear. Do you feel that what happened on Thursday is right? How about what happened on Friday? I believe that negotiations are going to take time. It's going to be very, very complicated. See Secretary Blinken fly to Jordan, fly to Qatar, fly back to Cairo, then go to Jerusalem. This is not easy negotiations. These people are all very set in their policy areas. So I think it's better for the vast majority of members of Congress to sort of keep a lid on it. Don't comment. We're not, as I said a second ago, we're not all running for Secretary of State. As members of Congress, we have our opinions. And what I suggest is that I would work my opinions with other Democrats through the Democratic House caucus, and so that Hakeem Jeffrey be able to interact with the president and give the sense of where the members of the House are on these issues. That creates a difference between me and the incumbent, but that makes me mainstream, and he's the outlier in terms of his philosophy on this.
You've said this before that you broadly support President Biden, Blinken, as well as the negotiating team there. But more broadly, when it comes to Israel, pro-Israel AIPAC has paid more than $12 million in attack ads against Bowman, according to Politico. And you've been criticized for this by Bowman. He's also accused you of being funded by far-right Republican mega donors. What's your response when you hear that?
Well, that's campaign baloney, to be honest with you. First of all, the donors that donate to AIPAC, that have donated to my campaign, in the main are people who live in Westchester and the Bronx. They donate through the AIPAC portal, but they are residents of Scarsdale and New Rochelle and Larchmont and Mamaroneck. They know me, they like me, and they know that I'm supportive of Israel. I don't give Israel a blank check, but I'm not hostile to Israel, and that's very important. The reason why I have the support of AIPAC is the same reason why he lost the support of J Street. He has become hostile to Israel. He said things like they're a colonial settler organization. He used the phrase Zionist entity a few days ago when he was referring to 75 years of occupation. These are the code words of the people who hate Israel and oppose them. And so the donations that I have gotten, I've got because I have a mainstream position on Israel. And I might add, the very people that criticize me because AIPAC supports me are blind to the fact that AIPAC supports 50% of the Congressional Black Caucus, all of those aforementioned congressmen. So they want to make me an outlier. And I guess what happens in politics is you try to turn your opponent into who you wanted your opponent to be. They would prefer if I were a MAGA Republican, so they call me that. But that's not referenced in my record. The things that I've actually done. And I have a long public record. I understand from the national media, nobody's looking at what I've done in Westchester. Nobody's looking at what I've done in the New York State Legislature. It's not interesting enough. It's not a national story. But that's who I am. And so when somebody says to me, oh my God, this person donated money to you, I don't change my position because of a donation. I appreciate the donation. And then let's turn the tables. I mean, Brittany, let's be realistic. Where's he getting his money from? He has 90% of his money coming from outside the district. 50% plus of mine is inside the district. He's had fundraisers in California with who knows who in the room. and what their interests are. He did a fundraiser in Fairfax County in the beginning of May that had some people that are associated with various Middle Eastern industry interests. Um, he's been linked to financial people with connections to Turkey and what their philosophies are. So there's much to answer for in his side of the ledger. And when he talks about the source of my funding, he doesn't go back over all of the things that the Justice Democrats believe politically, or all the things that the Democratic Socialists of America believe politically. That's what he's attached to. So I think my public record shows that I'm not motivated by the money that I get. The money that I get helps me make my case out in the community. And when they're independent expenditures, I don't control them anyway. The messages that I make, I deliver. One final point on this, because he mentioned so much of it. I do want to highlight that. 2 years ago, he had the financial advantage over his opponents. He wasn't complaining about outside money then, was he? He had the money that was coming in from the Our Revolution Network, and he pounded his opponents with having superior resources. He himself said, "Bring it on, I'm ready to take it." And now he's not so happy because the people that aren't happy with him have brought it on. And all I can say is that at this stage of the game, I'm making my case on the merits. If the voters think that I have sufficient merits, they'll vote for me. If they don't think I have sufficient merits, they'll vote for him. But the winner will be who the voters think should. It's not going to be determined just by how much money someone raises.
You opined about that sentiment in a recent interview that what you've done in Westchester is not part of the national conversation at all when it comes to your run, when it comes to this race, really highly competitive primary in 2024. So I guess we can end on this note. What's one thing you've done in Westchester as the county executive that would be most reflective of you as a Congress member?
It's hard to say one thing because there's so many things that are elements of different public policies. Our fiscal policy has restrained lowering property taxes. That's an important economic indicator. That's why I look at a budget in its entirety before somebody says, "You're going to raise taxes." I want to look at all the revenue streams first. I don't think that's an unrealistic thing to do. That's a reasonable thing to do. And that's because I have run a government. I also served a corporate life, and you don't make proclamations about things you're going to do until you know all the facts that relate to it. I think we've done so many things that reflect my progressive values. We have a Black maternal health care initiative. He wants to try to, frame my record differently. We've lowered the cost of childcare. We've expanded the environmental initiatives. We've lowered the amount of garbage we generate. That's an important issue. So I know you want me to give you one. It's hard to say because there isn't one overarching thing that says it for everybody. But I'd say this: anybody who lives in Westchester County who gets on a public bus in July and August and they ride for free, that's something that makes a statement. And it makes a statement because I grew up as a poor working class kid, and I didn't have bus money every day. And my parents didn't have the money to give me. But now the kid who grows up in the room that I grew up in, south side of Mount Vernon, they'll have free buses all summer. And maybe that's as good a symbolism of my tenure as any.
George, we are less than a week out from primary day. What are you doing between now and then?
Doing everything I can. I get up early every morning. I meet commuters at the train stations on the weekdays, and I stand in front of restaurant, deli, bagel shops on Saturdays and Sundays. I've been to, appropriately so, those religious services that would invite a visitor, visit senior centers. I've gone to neighborhood association meetings. I've stood in front of supermarkets. I do all those things. That's the old school retail politics. I know that I have met more people in this district over the course of this campaign than my opponent has, and I think it's reflected in the endorsements I have. When he'll tweet out, he'll say, "I'm with the people against the money." Well, the civil service workers have endorsed me. Bus drivers and the mechanics have endorsed me. I have the endorsements of the plumbers, the firefighters, the electricians, the laborers. I have the support of the local Democratic committees in 11 of the 12 communities in Westchester. The 12th community didn't endorse. I have support of elected officials, and I have support of elected officials who are African American, elected officials who are Latino, elected officials who are Asian, all across the ethnic boundary. People who've worked with me and know exactly who I am as a person. So I think I've shown the grassroots support. Now, I recognize it may not look that way. My age and my demographic package speaks to establishment out of touch. But I believe I've done everything that you can do to stay in touch. My campaign reflects the way I've governed. And I think that's why when the results come in on Tuesday night, people who didn't look at my record, didn't know how much grassroots I have, may well be surprised by what they see.
George Latimer, thank you so much. primary in New York is June 25th. We look forward to the results, and I appreciate you coming on today.
Thank you, Brittany. It's a pleasure to talk to you again.